Hey everyone, and welcome to this month's live event with National Sewing Circle. Once again, we have Nicki here to answer all of your sewing questions. So thanks for being here, Nicki.
Thanks, I'm glad to be here.
Of course. So now I don't know what the weather's like where you live or where it's like where everyone is watching from, but it is definitely summer here. So I want to talk a little bit about summer sewing projects and what the best type of fabrics to use for summer sewing projects are.
Yes, so I'm in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan where it is very hot and humid. So it's definitely summer. So yeah, thinking about summer sewing, depending on what you're making, you want to do fabrics that are breathable. So like 100% cotton is awesome because it's airy and breathable. Of course, it all depends on the weave that you get as well. So any type of fabric can be woven in different types of weaves. So the quilting cotton you get is typically a plain weave, which means it's one thread over the other. A canvas fabric is typically going to be a twill weave, which is one over and four under, something like that. So it's a little bit tighter woven. So that would be probably stiffer, not so good for garments and things like that. But so a plain kind of openish weave is really great for breathability. Fabrics like cotton lawn is really great because it's really drapey and breathable and soft against the skin. If you are doing something in a knit fabric, like a t-shirt or a dress or whatever in a knit fabric, jersey knits are great for summer sewing and summer wearing because they're really comfortable, soft against your skin, and very breathable as well. And jersey knits will come in all kinds of different weights. You can get the really drapey, slinky kind, which feel awesome on your skin. They come with some sewing challenges. We can talk about that later if we want to. But those are great for wearing in summer. Fibers you may want to avoid include the man-made fibers such as polyester. It's not breathable. If you get a cotton poly blend, if the polyester content is not super high, you'll probably be fine. And that some people don't mind, or some people mind polyester more than others. I really dislike wearing polyester, so a little percentage would probably be okay, but I probably wouldn't want to tolerate anything more than 50% polyester. It just makes me sweat, and that's very person to person. Your personal preferences will determine that as well. So I avoid polyester. I avoid acrylic. It's another man-made fiber that not very breathable. It's not very soft in some blends and some weaves. So if you're in the fabric store and if you're feeling around for fibers, choose something that is soft against your skin, because in summer you're not going to want to wear layers. You're not going to want to wear something under the thing that you're sewing to put it between the fabric and your skin. So make sure you get something soft. Cotton is awesome. More open weaves, nothing too tight. And you can tell how tight the weave is. A lot of times if it is stiffer, the weave will be tighter. So a more loose weave will make it a little more drapey. That also depends on how thin the fibers are or how thin the threads are. So if like cotton lawn is a really fine thread, but it's a nice tight weave. So so you'll get a feel for what things are breathable after sewing and wearing things for a bit.
So you mentioned the weave of fabric. I know you like to shop online for fabric a lot of times. I usually just go to Joann's because they have coupons. But so if I'm shopping online and I can't necessarily feel something, how do I know what weave is what?
Yeah, it's harder online because some online stores are better than others about putting more information in the fabric, in the description. So some will even tell you how many threads per inch there are, and that is a good indicator of how tight the weave is and how thin the threads are. So like in, almost like in a sheet, you know, sheets will tell you a thread count. Some online fabric stores will tell you how many threads per inch in the weave. And if they are super good about it, they'll tell you the kind of weave. And you can even, there's not a lot of times, there might not be a lot of reviews on the fabric, but there are in a lot of online stores places for people to put in reviews of the fabric. So you can scroll down and see if by chance someone has written a review about it. That's really helpful. And if you ever buy fabric online, you should write a review and try to, you know, help
Help
other
out the
people.
next person.
Yeah.
Yeah. Perfect. All right. We have a question here, and just reading it first, I feel like we might need some follow-up. This is from Susan, just because I've never heard of this type of material, but she says, when you are using scuba material for embroidery and making squares, say for a quilt or wall hanging, should you use a batting under it?
I wonder if she means scrub material.
I don't know. Isn't scrub material like a cotton though?
Yeah.
Okay.
Because scuba, that's like
I'm
thick.
thinking like neoprene. Yeah.
And
Okay, and I don't feel like I want a neoprene quilt. Maybe I don't want to say no, because that could be cool.
I don't know that you could embroider on neoprene because
All right, let's assume the question is scrub material and we're talking with a cotton. And if that's not the case, Susan, please let us know.
let us know. So yeah, scrub material is just like a plain weave cotton. If you're using that for embroidery, making squares for a quilt or wall hanging, should you use batting under it? Well, so you're using stabilizer under it to embroider, but then should you use batting under it when you put it into a quilt? That's the question.
I'm going to say, I would say answer them two separately. Like pretend the embroidery is one, and then yes, you would use batting if you're making it into a quilt. Yeah.
So yeah, you always want to use stabilizer when you're embroidering. When you're embroidering anything. And sometimes you want to use more than one type of stabilizer, depending on what fabric you're embroidering. So for a scrub material, just like a nice thin cotton, I would probably use a tearaway stabilizer under it. And that helps support the threads of the design so that if you didn't use stabilizer, it would, you know, stretch out the fabric and it would weigh down the fabric. So stabilizer just helps support the threads. So tearaway stabilizer comes in a fabric type of variety and a film type variety. And the film type variety is a lot of times a clear film, very, very lightweight. I usually use the fabric type variety. And it's just kind of medium weight, and after you embroider, you just tear it off around the perimeter of the design. And the stabilizer stays underneath those threads inside the design for the life of the garment. So yes, use stabilizer. And then if you are making a quilt or wall hanging, I would say yes, use batting, but also I have never made a quilt before. I have read a lot of tutorials and edited a lot of tutorials for quilts, but I've never actually start to finish made one. So Ashley has made a whole pile.
I have a whole pile. Yes, and there's sort of like this debate about whether a quilt is a quilt if you don't have batting in between it. Technically, it's supposed to be 3 layers and then you stitch through it, but some people do consider just 2 layers and then stitching a quilt. But if you're going to get particular, yes, I would say you need to use batting to make a quilt. And then in terms of like what batting you use, similar to how you can pick interfacings and stuff based on your fabric type, you can do that with batting too. So if you have, you know, a cotton fabric quilt and you want to do 100% cotton batting, you can do that. There's polyester, cotton poly blends, all sorts of things. And if you want more information on batting, you can go to our sister site, which is nationalquiltercircle.com. And I actually did a video on all different types of batting, and you can watch that there. So I know we've talked a little bit about this in the past, but if someone's never done embroidery before, what is the difference between stabilizer and interfacing?
That is a good question, and that's something that trips people up a lot because they're very similar. In embroidery, it's called stabilizer. In interfacing, or in sewing, it's called interfacing. And in sewing, interfacing is used to give strength and crispness to certain areas of a garment, such as collars, cuffs. You use it behind buttonholes to reinforce the back of a zipper area. So you're reinforcing the fabric and strengthening it, which is basically what you're using stabilizer for as well in embroidery. But stabilizer is kind of in a category of its own because it comes in some distinct subsections. So it comes in a heat removable variety, a water soluble variety, a tearaway variety, and a cutaway variety. And you want to try to match the weight of the stabilizer you use to the weight of the fabric you're using. So if you're using something really light and slinky, you probably want to use a water soluble stabilizer. And I misspoke earlier. It's the water soluble variety that comes in a film type and a fabric type. The tearaway variety only comes in the fabric-y, kind of papery type. Correct myself there. So the heat removable and water soluble varieties come in a kind of a clear film type material, and those are good for toppers as well. So if you're embroidering something that has a nap, like a terry cloth towel or like a minky or something like that, fleece that has it's kind of puffy or has a nap or something. You'll want to use a topper over it. So you hoop the stabilizer. You might hoop the fabric as well, or you might just lay the fabric over the hoop, and then you float the topper over the fabric, and that kind of raises up the stitches to keep them from sinking down into the pile of the fabric, so they don't just disappear into the threads of the terry cloth towel or whatever it is. And then you can kind of tear that film away from around the edges of the design, or take the tip of your iron if it's a heat removable type and kind of touch it to the perimeter of the design. It's water soluble. Take a rag and some water, go around the outside of the design and it just dissolves away. And the cutaway stabilizer is the thickest and the stiffest type. And as the name suggests, after you're done embroidering, you cut away the stabilizer from the perimeter of the design. So depending on what you're embroidering and the end use, like if you're embroidering a t-shirt or something and the back of the design is going to be against your skin, you're not going to want to use a cutaway stabilizer because that's going to be, first of all, too stiff for your fabric probably. And then as you cut it away, it's going to leave a lot of stabilizer behind to rub against your skin, and that's probably not going to be comfortable. So using a water-soluble stabilizer removes the stabilizer from everything. The stabilizer doesn't even remain under the threads. So it's good for knit fabrics, things that you want to be able to move with the garment and move with your body. They will be lighter weight, more comfortable against the skin. So yeah, that is an overarching view of stabilizer versus interfacing.
Perfect. I have a question about interfacing in a minute, but I want to ask about stabilizer. Just so I recently was removing some patches from some of my husband's work shirts, and they had some embroidery on them, and they had just big patches of cutaway stabilizer that they didn't even really trim up that well. It's just a big, square behind the custom store-made embroidery kind of things. How would you sort of make that a little bit softer and make that a little bit more, I don't know, what you want to wear against your skin?
So are you asking if you can take something that has been embroidered already and make it?
Or is there a way to remove some of that extra stabilizer without taking away from the design or making it to where I could accidentally make the design fall out or something?
I don't know, because you can cut away the excess stabilizer from around the perimeter of the design, but you don't want to get too close to the design because if you clip a thread, then it's going to start fraying. You could try washing it. You could soak it. What do you soak fabrics in to make them softer, like vinegar or something? Is that what, I think I may have read something like that. Don't quote me on that.
I'm going to have to Google that. I've never heard that, and now I'm intrigued because if that is a thing, I'm going to try it.
Yeah, I feel like you can soak fabrics in something to make them softer. I would worry that it would like degrade the fibers a little bit, but yeah, that's a very vague memory. So we can Google that and see.
I'll Google that, and then we'll let everybody know.
Other than that, I'm not sure what you could really do with something that has already been embroidered.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. Our next one here, this is from Debbie, and she wants to know, what can you use to mark fabrics such as fleece for darts?
Yeah, so marking your fabrics, the type of marker or, you know, the thing that you use to mark your pattern markings depends on what fabric you're using. So I had, oh, what was it? I think it was a tencel fabric, which is a really slinky fabric that's made from bamboo fibers. And I was trying to mark it with my carbon tracing paper and my little roller, and it was just not, it was not happening. And it was driving me crazy. So I had to go to something else. So if you're using a fabric like a sheer fabric or something that you don't want to damage with like a marker, or if you're worried the marker is going to bleed through to the other side and not come out or whatever, tailor's tacks are awesome. And that would probably be great to use for fleece as well, because the tracing paper in the wheel is not going to work on fleece. I feel like a marker would be really hard on fleece as well, because it's so, it's got, you know, the nap and the pile, the fluffiness to it that wouldn't really, the marker would probably not work well. So yeah, tailor's tacks. You just use a hand sewing needle and a double strand of thread that is in high contrast to your fabric. And with the pattern still down on your fabric, just take a little stitch through whatever marking you're doing. So if it's like a dot, take a little stitch through the pattern paper and through the fabric. Leave a long thread tail at the end. And I usually do like an X stitch. So I take one stitch and then I do another one, like, what is that? Not parallel, perpendicular. And leave a long loop as well in between the stitch, and then a long thread tail at the end. And then clip the loop, take the pattern off. And then if you've got a double layer of fabric, separate the layers a little bit and clip the threads in between so that you have some threads in each layer. If you're doing a single layer, you don't need to worry about that. But for double layers, do that. And then for like lines, like darts, or if you need to mark a center line or something, just do the same thing, except do a running stitch. Just leave lots of tail at both ends, and then leave big loops in your stitches. Then just clip all the loops on the front and the back. And then when you separate them, make sure you've got a good amount of thread still in each of the layers, and then clip in between the layers. And you'll have, it's not as, you know, as, I'm not going to say it's not as good, but it doesn't give you as much of a guideline as the tracing paper and the wheel. But, you know, when the wheel isn't going to work for you, you know, those tailor's tacks work great for just giving you your guideline. And then once you sew the garment, you gotta like pick the threads out. Mm-hmm. But that's all. Yeah, and they work great.
I've actually never tried one of those before. I always use pins. I just do like pin marks, like with little pins all on the edge, and then as you're sewing it, then you can either use those pins to hold it in place, and then you put them to where the tip of the needle is, you know, going through the machine first. That way you can remove them as you get to them, because you really can't sew over them. So that would work for something small like a dart, but maybe on something bigger, like you said, where you have to mark a center line or something, maybe not as practical to put that many pins in that. But if you just need a quick little mark, pins could work too.
Good idea.
Our next one here, this is from Tisha, and she says, any tips on cutting out patterns straight?
Yeah, so for cutting out your patterns, when you lay your fabric down on your cutting mat or your cutting table or whatever, make sure that you don't have any fabric hanging off the edge of the table, because the weight of that fabric is going to pull and you're going to get, it's going to shift and it's not going to be, you know, straight. It's going to be off grain and weird. So make sure the fabric is all on the table so nothing is hanging off and pulling. I recommend using a rotary cutter when cutting out your patterns. It just gives you a tighter fit, especially in the curves of your pattern. And when you're using scissors, you know, it kind of pulls the fabric up from the surface of the table. So rotary cutter, you don't have that. I feel like you get a little bit more of an accurate cut with a rotary cutter. Just be extremely careful, because I sliced my finger on my rotary cutter a couple weeks ago. And so yeah, last time in the video, I may have had a big Band-Aid on my finger. That's what that was from. I went to the ER. It was bad.
Well, okay, that's a lesson in, they always say, you know, use sharp knives in the kitchen. Definitely have sharp scissors and sharp rotary cutters. Just maybe you need protective gloves. I'm not sure.
I think they make them too,
I
protective
think
gloves.
so.
Just be really super careful because they are extremely sharp. And any other tips for cutting out patterns straight? I always, after I wash my fabric when I get it home, I clip a little bit and tear it to get it on the straight grain, which works obviously only for woven fabrics. So that'll get you on the straight grain. Sometimes in the weaving process, and you know, all the stuff fabric goes through is winding it on the bolt and everything. Sometimes it gets a little bit stretched out of whack. So I clip it somewhere near the top, a couple inches down, and tear it across selvage to selvage to get it on the straight grain. And yeah, just try to make sure your selvages are matched up if you're folding your fabric to cut it. And yeah, that's all.
Perfect. And I was just going to share one little tip that you and I both got from an instructor we worked with years ago, Cynthia Guffey. And she used to always say that your scissors should always be between you and what you're cutting out. So if you have your pattern piece laying here, you should be cutting rather than trying to reach and cut on the other side. There's less lift, I guess, in the pattern pieces when your scissors are closest to you. So if you can like rotate or walk around, that was always her tip, which I've done that. I guess I never know. I don't know. I didn't notice if any issue not doing it, but now that she said it, now I consciously always do it.
Right,
But
yeah.
just because I know that you have a small cutting table and I'm temporarily working on one, which is driving me nuts. If you're using a rotary cutter and your rotary mat is smaller than your pattern piece, how do you go about moving your rotary mat underneath your pieces without getting everything, you know, shifted off too much?
Yeah, so what I would do there is I would cut the excess fabric off at the bottom of the pattern piece so that I'm not trying to rotate a big, you know, the excess half yard of fabric at the bottom of the pattern piece. Cut it, like roughly cut it first, so that as you are, you know, you cut out on your mat, and then as you need to shift it up to the rest of the fabric on your mat, you're not dragging all that excess weight and stuff, and that'll help keep that from moving the pattern on your fabric. And yeah, the less amount of moving of the pattern you can do on the fabric, the better. If your cutting mat is small, there's not much you can do about it, but as much as you can. Instead of trying to rotate the pattern around as you're cutting, I would walk around the table or shift around the cutting mat so that that fabric and that pattern stays stationary on the mat as much as possible.
Perfect. All right, we were talking about stabilizer and interfacing earlier, and I'm going to get back to our interfacing question, but we had a question about what is the best type of interfacing to use to stiffen bags and purses?
So that all depends on your intended finished look. Typically for bags, I just use a medium weight, although they do make some super stiff interfacing. I don't remember what it's called. Maybe it's just like a heavyweight interfacing. They make something that's called like craft interfacing as well. And it's just really stiff, like cardboard, but it's interfacing. So it's got some flex to it, but it's like it'll stand up on its own. I used that in a bag. It was my first time doing it, and I couldn't really like sew it to the bag. You can't sew it into a seam allowance and then turn it inside out. You know, you can't turn it because it's so thick and stiff. So I stitched my bag and I left my lining and outer fabric layer open at the top, and I slid it down inside in between the layers. And that worked really well. And it's a really nice, strong, stiff bag. I can, you know, set it down and have it stand up on its own, which is cool. But for my other bags that were just, you know, cotton cloth bags, to strengthen them and give them a little bit of body, I would just use medium weight interfacing. And I use the iron-on variety. So I iron that on and stitch it, and you know, you stitch a little bit into the seam allowances, and it's still flexible enough that you can turn everything right side out, but it gives the bag a little bit of body and stiffness and strength. So yeah, just like a medium weight interfacing, but again, depending on what type of look you're going for. I think a lightweight interfacing would not give enough stability. And then the heavyweight, you're getting into it maybe being too thick to turn right side out with it being stitched into the seam allowance. So yeah, it depends on the specific design, but a medium weight is a good, you know, middle of the road thing to try.
So even if you are going to use the fusible type, would you still fuse it into the seam allowances, or would you try to just keep it within the seam allowance boundary? That way you don't have that extra bulk when you turn it right side out?
I would still stitch it into the seam allowance, because with wear and use, and if you throw it in the wash, sometimes the glue will come apart from the fabric, and you don't want that to then get, you know, all jumbled up in between your layers. So having it stitched in at least a couple of seams helps make sure that stays put.
Perfect. Just to follow that up, because I've had this happen just recently, is there a way, if you have something that's fused in place interfacing wise, you put it in the wash, it kind of comes apart, is there a way to get it back together? Does it refuse, or is it kind of a lost cause and you have to stitch it in place?
I have never tried it. If it came unfused, that to me says that there's still some glue left on it. So you could try getting it nice and flat and in place again and refusing it using as high of a heat as you can on that fabric and a lot of pressure. So like put the whole weight of your body down on that iron, count to 10, 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, you know, count to 10, good and slow, and get that as glued on as you can.
Perfect. All right, next one here. This is from Jackie, and she says, jersey knit is a comfortable fabric for shorts, but it's a nightmare to sew with. It rolls and slips. Any suggestions for making the sewing experience more enjoyable?
Yes, thank you for that question, Jackie. Jersey knit does offer some you know, some troubles in sewing with. So one of the main, or one of the more common problems I hear with jersey knit fabric is that it gets jammed down in your throat plate. So some jersey knit fabrics are so thin and slinky that the needle just pops it right down into your throat plate, and then you get a big jumbled up, tangled mess with your threads and the fabric, and you've got to, you know, try and cut it out of there. So there are a couple things you can do to avoid that. A lot of times that will happen at the beginning of a seam. So you can start a couple of half inch or a couple of stitches in from the edge, back stitch 1 or 2, and then continue on with the seam so that you're not right at the edge of the fabric where it's more likely to get jammed down into your throat plate. There is such a thing as a single stitch throat plate, which has a smaller opening in the throat plate so that fabric won't get jammed down in there, but you can only use a straight stitch with it. You can't use a zigzag stitch. So that might be useful in some scenarios, but when you're sewing knit fabrics, a lot of times you want to be able to use a zigzag stitch for your stretch stitch to make sure the seam can stretch. So there's that. You can use like a starter square at the beginning of your seam. Use a starter square of, you know, a stiffer fabric, like a woven fabric, to get that seam started, and then butt your other seam up against it and keep on going. That might also help. You can overlap your starter square with your knit fabric as well, and then just cut that off after it is stitched. You also want to make sure I'm just going to give you all my knit fabric tips.
Perfect, because we talked earlier about how we were going to get back to these summer fabrics and talking about them anyway. So,
yeah. So sewing with knits, you want to make sure you're using a ballpoint needle. Sometimes it is called you can also use a stretch needle or a jersey needle. They are all kind of the same shape and the same construction of needle. They're made for knit fabrics. So instead of being a really sharp pointed tip, the tip is slightly rounded so that instead of piercing through the fibers of the fabric, it kind of nestles in between the knit construction of the fabric. And that just helps, you know, preserve the fabric so you don't get runs and stuff. Make sure you're using an all-purpose thread. You just don't want to use a 100% cotton thread with knit fabrics because that thread doesn't have any give to it. All-purpose thread is a cotton wrapped polyester core, I think, or is it the other way around?
I think it's right. I think you're right.
Okay. Yeah, cotton wrapped polyester core. So that the polyester has a little bit of give to it. So 100% polyester thread also would be great to use with knit fabrics. And as far as it slipping, you can get a lot of creeping when you're stitching knit fabric. So creeping is just when you come to the end of the seam, you know, one end is a little bit longer than the other. So the layers shift as you're sewing them. So to combat that, you can use a walking foot, a roller foot, anything to help the upper layer of fabric feed along under the presser foot, because on the underside, on that bottom layer, you've got the feed dogs pulling the fabric along. So you want something on the upper side to pull the fabric along at the same rate. So a walking foot, roller foot. If you have a Teflon foot, it's just got kind of like a slick underside to help that fabric go under the foot. My FOF Passport 2.0 has the integrated dual feed foot, which is basically a built-in walking foot. I just pull it down and hook it under the foot, and it helps walk that along, which is awesome. I usually have that engaged all the time anyway, and it really helps. As far as the jersey fabric rolling, I know the edges roll a lot, and that can be frustrating when you're cutting the fabric out to get everything to lay flat. And if you iron it, a lot of times that will help with the rolling. But then as soon as you pick it up, it's going to try to start rolling again. But you want to try to keep everything nice and flat. I use a lot of pins, especially when sewing knits. Helps keep everything together in the right spots. It can help with the rolling at the edges. So yeah, I use a lot of pins. And if you're getting a lot of creeping and a lot of rolling and things like that, you can take a hand sewing needle and thread and just baste on either side of your seam, or machine baste on either side of your seam to keep everything right where it needs to be before you stitch your seam.
Would you ever use it's like a knit stay tape? It's like a really thin strip of interfacing almost, but you can put that in your seam. It keeps it from rolling and makes it a little bit, it's kind of like a tissue paper alternative, which I'm so surprised you haven't mentioned yet.
So that's what you were smiling about. You're waiting for me to say tissue paper.
It's actually not. I have to tell you, the reason I'm smiling is because the question came from my mom, and you mentioned basting, and she will never baste anything ever. She's always like, I will use 100 pins before I baste anything. She doesn't baste. So that's what I was smiling about, but also the tissue paper reference too.
Yeah, yeah. Typically, I don't baste things either unless I've got a whole bunch of layers I've got to keep together. But if you get a lot of creeping, that can really help. And that's typically a tip that I pull out when someone's sewing with velvet with the nap. But yes, tissue paper, that can stop the shifting of the layers. And that can also help stabilize your seam if you're getting the needle cramming the thread down into the throat plate. Put some tissue paper under it. It just helps stabilize it. That's a good tip also for when you're using a zigzag stitch, like if you're finishing off the hem or a neckline or something, and it's getting kind of stretched out, put some tissue paper under it and it'll help stabilize it, and then you can just tear it away afterward. So yeah, tissue paper is a good tool for when you're sewing knits. You asked about knit stay tape, and I think the only time I have ever used that is in the shoulder seams of a knit garment. That just, helps to keep them from stretching out, kind of like a little stabilizer. But I have not used it since then, and that was in college because the pattern said to do it, and I haven't come across a pattern telling me to do that since. But yeah, that would be a good thing to help stabilize a seam.
Perfect. All right, next question here. This is from Tisha, and she says, what causes the buttonhole thread to come out as you start sewing?
As you start sewing, I don't really understand the question. The buttonhole thread to come out as you start sewing.
So I'm gonna, Tisha, if you're still watching, if you can do some clarification, I'm just gonna start throwing out some suggestions of maybe what I think you might be talking about. But I've had issues when I'm using like an automatic buttonhole or buttonholer. As soon as you start sewing, like maybe the needle comes unthreaded. And I know with my machine specifically, it tells me that you have to hold on to that needle thread as it starts sewing. So that is what I think might be happening. I'm not sure if that's correct. But while we're waiting for her to comment back, what are your buttonhole tips?
Good segue. Yeah, that has never happened to me, to have the needle come unthreaded as I start sewing my buttonhole. So thank you for jumping in there. So for buttonholes, I recommend having some interfacing on the wrong side of your buttonhole, because you're putting a lot of thread down in one little layer. And a buttonhole is a stress point on the garment. You're shoving a button in and out of it, and if it's across the chest area, sometimes it gets pulled against, and some tension stretching against the buttonhole. So interfacing is a really good idea. Buttonholes, if you don't have, so I have a buttonhole foot for my machine, which is super cool. I wonder if I can, yeah. There it is. So there's my buttonhole foot. I was just using it to stitch the buttonholes in this shirt, so it was at the ready. So the ones that have you put the button in it are cool, because so this thing slides. So you put whatever button you're using in it and cinch it down, and that changes this distance right here. And this is going to be the distance of your buttonhole. So it kind of measures it. You can tell that this is a tiny little 3/8 diameter button. So you can see that this is wider than that. So it automatically adds a little bit to your buttonhole to allow for the thickness of the button and the fabric, so that you don't end up getting a buttonhole that your button won't go through. So that's cool. It kind of measures it for you. And you clip, that on as your presser foot, and you pull down the buttonhole tab, which is going to be kind of back here. You pull it down, and it's got the little buttonhole on my FOP. Anyway, it's got the buttonhole graphic. So that will sit between these two little tabs. And as you stitch, it's going to go, you stitch, the foot's going to move, and then that tab is going to hit the back little flange, and that tells the machine time to stop and stitch the other leg of the buttonhole. So that's kind of how it measures the length of the buttonhole. So that's cool. You don't have to do anything but stamp your foot down on the foot pedal and it does it all for you. I recommend stitching a sample before you start stitching on your fabric, because you want to know which way it's going to go, if it's going to go forward first or if it's going to go backward first, and you know which direction, which leg it stitches first, because you don't want to line it up one way and have it go, you know, the opposite direction as you intended it to go. So stitch a sample first so that you can know which way it's going around the buttonhole. But if you don't have one of these, you can still stitch buttonholes just using your zigzag stitch. And I did a video on this. I think it's part of my intermediate sewing skills video on National Sewing Circle. But you can use your zigzag stitch and your standard presser foot. Just measure the diameter of your button, add 1/8 to 1/4 inch depending on your fabric. If you're using a thick fabric, I would add 1/4 inch to your buttonhole to allow that button to get through the thickness of the fabric. And mark your buttonhole marking on your garment and test stitch your zigzag stitch settings first on a scrap, because you want to get, for the legs, you want to get like a satin stitch kind of zigzag stitch so that the zigzag is really close together and also not too wide. So test that out, find the settings for that, write them down. And then for the bar tack at each end of the buttonhole, you're going to lower your feed dogs and adjust the zigzag stitch width so that it covers both, you know, both legs of the buttonhole, and just stitch, you know, 7 or 8 times for that, the bar tack on each side. And the legs of the buttonhole, obviously you want them to be have a little distance between them so that when you're cutting open the buttonhole, you don't accidentally cut your threads. So probably not quite 1/8 of an inch between your legs, but between 1/16 and 1/8 of an inch between your legs. However much distance you think you can clip the fabric between without accidentally clipping the threads. And yeah, when I'm doing a buttonhole with just a zigzag stitch, I always leave long thread tails and I pull them to the wrong side of the fabric and I tie them off. And then I also use fray check on the wrong side as well to make sure that nothing is going to come undone, because like I mentioned, it's an area of the garment where you're moving it a lot. You're putting a lot of stress on those threads. So to make sure nothing is going to come unraveled, I use that fray check or whatever fabric glue you got, put a little dab on those knots. So yeah, buttonholes.
Perfect. I have a follow-up question here because I hate buttonholes, like affectionately hate them. If it was acceptable to just wear shirts with Velcro down the front, I would do that instead. Because when I try to cut open a buttonhole, you always end up with a couple of sort of threads. It kind of frays, and like the first couple times you put your button in and then take it out, it's like it gets caught on those edges. So how can you make the inside of a buttonhole clean without making a miniature bound buttonhole or something?
Right. Yes. So those threads that get caught on your button the first couple times you're using it are the threads of the fabric that you have cut and that are kind of fraying a little bit on the inside. So those you can just clip off. And as you are, so when you're cutting, when you are cutting the buttonhole open, it's not directly related to the question, but to make sure you don't clip the threads of the buttonhole, I always put a pin along the bar tack on each side, and I always use my seam ripper and just you know, cut it open with the seam ripper. And those pins in the bar tacks make sure I don't accidentally go right through the bar tack. They do, I think, make a buttonhole like opener, like a cutter for inside the buttonhole. I have no idea what it looks like or how to use it, but they make one, and I'm assuming that it would make it a lot easier and cleaner to cut open your buttonhole. So there's that. And if you are worried about accidentally clipping the threads of your buttonhole, I would say use some fray check. Just put a little fray check on the wrong side of the buttonhole on those threads. And I mean, that's what it's for, is to stop things from fraying. So put a little bit of that on the wrong side, let it dry before you cut open your buttonhole. And then, yeah, to clean up the inside of the buttonhole, you can just cut those threads, because those will be, there'll be threads going with the length of the buttonhole. So yeah, you can just clip those out, because that's just the excess fabric in there.
Perfect. Now, just to talk about fray check a little bit, because I know a lot of people either love it and they use it all the time, or they've never used it, and there's a little bit of a misconception about it. It's not a glue. It doesn't like dry super stiff or anything, right? It just kind of makes the edges not fray.
Yes. So yeah, it doesn't dry stiff. It's just this clear liquid. And I have had this, honestly, for like 10 years, and that is as much as I have used of it. So a little bit goes a really long way. When I'm putting buttons on, I always put a dab on the thread on the back of my buttons as well, to just keep it strong, keep it from going anywhere. Yeah, so it's not going to dry thick and stiff. It's really a thin kind of adhesive. So yeah, it's thin and viscous. So yep.
Perfect. I know we have a video on our site, and I haven't pointed out enough of them yet, so I have to talk about one. We do have an instructor where she does give some sort of fun tips of alternative products you can use if you don't have the actual sewing product on hand. And so she talks about using clear nail polish on the wrong side of buttons to do sort of the same thing, dab it on there. But she does point out that you really only want to use that when it's either not going to be directly up against your skin, if possible, or since a button is already kind of stiff, adding that, stiff nail polish behind a button isn't a huge deal, but maybe putting it somewhere where you don't want it stiff is not something you should do. But just a fun little thing if you don't have any fray check and you do your nails often, just put a little on there. So you've made reference to it a couple times, so of course I have to ask you if you made your shirt, because you usually wear the ones you make. I didn't make them.
Yeah, I've been waiting for you to ask. I'm like, buttonholes. I know. Yes, I did make this shirt, and this is actually a pattern that I designed for a National Sewing Circle pattern collection. So this pattern will be on the website in a little while. I don't know how long it takes to package and get it up online. But yeah, it was the base pattern was a vintage, like 1980s pattern that I got from my grandmother-in-law, and I added a yoke to it. But yeah, it's a little bit of a boxier shape. There aren't any darts for shaping, but it's nice and kind of flowy. I've got gathers here at the front yoke and on the back of the yoke as well. So it's got a lot of airflow, so it's good for summer.
Perfect, since you're talking about summer sewing. If you have a shirt pattern like that, or you're sewing with a pattern and you want to add a yoke into it to do sort of that contrasting fabric color like you've done, is that something you can easily add into a pattern? And if so, how do you do it?
Yeah, it's super easy. Adding a yoke is as easy as drawing a line on your pattern and cutting those pattern pieces apart, and then add your seam allowances to those cut edges. And there's your yoke pattern. It's super easy. You don't have to alter anything else. I've got a facing in the sleeve here. You don't have to alter that, because you're joining these pieces anyway, so it becomes the same size as it would have been if you hadn't cut it apart.
Perfect. And then is there a difference between the patterns that, like you said, you cut out the piece to put the yoke in, as opposed to, say, like Western wear, where it's almost more of an overlay that has some embroidery onto it, where it's is just kind of put on top of the pattern piece? Sort of what's the difference between the two?
That's a good question. That's what I kind of tried to style this after, was that Western wear kind of thing. So I've got like the pointed thing here. Let me show you the back too, because it's cool. I've got my pointed yoke, the gathers. But as far as the construction of those Western style, I'm not sure how it's different, or if it is any different. They might just, you know, embroider on those pieces and then cut out the pattern piece over the embroidery and just stitch it to the shirt as you would normally stitch a yoke onto a shirt, which is another cool thing if you have an embroidery machine that you can do. But yeah, I'm not sure how that is different.
It was just one of those ones where you see the embroidery on the back, but then you don't actually see any of the threads on the inside. So it's like a lined yoke, essentially, I suppose is what I would call it.
Yes, yeah, actually, that the instructions for this pattern said to do that, and I changed it so that it is not lined, because it's pointed. I made it into a pointed yoke. It wasn't a pointed yoke to begin with. But yeah, so they have it as like, so instead of just cutting out one back yoke, you would cut out two, and then sandwich the back shirt between the yoke pieces and stitch that seam and then press it up so that the seam allowance is enclosed. And yeah, if you wanted to embroider on the outer one, then the threads would not be against your skin. It'd be concealed within those layers. So yeah, that's a very good point. I didn't think about that.
We shop at a lot of Western wear places here in Colorado. Just another fitting question. It may or may not relate to the shirt that you're wearing, but you mentioned it doesn't have any darts on it. And that's something that I know a lot of people would rather have, maybe a more fitted garment. I'm all for not fitted, but if you want to add darts, how easy is that to do, either to your pattern piece or to the garment once it's already made?
Very easy. Yep. If you wanted to add it to the pattern, you really just take a pencil and draw the lines on your pattern. So to do like a princess line dart on the shirt, you would start a couple inch or so below your bust point. You don't want a dart ending directly on your bust point. You want to back it off a little bit. And then princess line darts are typically pretty long, but it all depends on the shape of your body. I have a really long torso, so my princess darts are always enormously long, and I'm always extending them from the pattern sizes. So you can draw them as long as you need them to be. And the princess line darts, instead of just being like a V, they go from the point out to a V around your waistline and then go down to a point again, somewhere a couple inches up from the hem of your shirt, depending on how long it is. So yeah, draw it however long it needs to be, and then however wide it needs to be. So you can measure your pattern and then measure yourself if you want to do it that way, or if you have already stitched up a mock sample, or if you've already stitched up the actual thing, you can put it on and pin out as much as you need taken out. And just remember, when you are drawing the dart, you are drawing, so however wide your dart is, it's taking out that much times 2. Because if you draw your dart on your front pattern piece, you're taking out that much on each side, and same for the back, because those are typically on the fold or cut to or whatever. So remember that it's going to be double. And yeah, so it's really easy to draw in a dart. It's really easy to put in a dart after you've stitched something. Just make sure it is a long enough dart so that it tapers down nice and gentle, and so that you don't get a really noticeable huge point at the end of it.
So if you are adding a dart into one that's already made, you're sort of just, folding that fabric over and stitching. What do you do with that sort of flap of fabric that gets pinched and stitched? Like, you just leave it, or what do you do with it?
You can clip it out. You can take your pinking shears and cut it. Just leave 1/4 inch to a 1/2 inch seam allowance on the back. Pinking shears are great for doing things like that because then it kind of finishes off the seam allowance there as well. And yeah, and make sure you press those darts. I always press my darts toward the center so that the seam allowances go toward center. This is always what I was taught. I don't think it matters, just as long as you press it. And when you're pressing darts, if you have a ham, that is great for shaping the garment because you're adding shape with the dart. So if you try to press it flat on your flat board, you're going to get wrinkles around it, and you're going to be pressing wrinkles into your garment. So the ham just allows you to shape that garment. It's just like a kind of like a big ball-ish type shape. They call it a ham because it is kind of shaped like a ham. It's just, I don't know, it's kind of oddly shaped. I can't describe it. It's almost like an egg, kind of.
I was going to say a football, but there we go.
Football, yeah. Yep, that kind of oblong shape. Anyway, so that just allows you to press that that dart open or to one side without getting wrinkles all over the place.
So if you don't have a ham, you can probably make one as well too. But then isn't there also another sort of little pressing contraption that's a little smaller? I feel like I've seen you use one in the past. They can help you press out even up in like shoulder seams and areas like that.
Yeah, I have used a sleeve board, which is just basically like a little miniature ironing board. And it's called a sleeve board because it allows you to, you know, put your sleeve basically on it and iron open your sleeve seams without getting creases in, you know, each side of your sleeve. So it kind of fits in your sleeve. So yeah, that's a cool tool.
Absolutely. So I can't stress the importance of pressing tools enough, just because that's like the most important step in sewing something. If I say pressing is the most important step, what is your second most important step? And we'll end it with that. What is your most important step for helping make sure that your sewing projects end up the way you want them to?
I would say a very close second to pressing, because that is super, super important as well. But I would say pinning and making sure you're using the correct seam allowance. So if you don't have like a gauge, like my throat plate is marked. So I know if I line my raw edge with the 5/8 inch line, I'm going to get a 5/8 inch seam allowance. If you don't have that, I highly recommend marking your seam allowances on your fabric. And it's really easy if you're using a fabric that is easy to mark. Like if you have a chalk wheel, I have one of those little chalk wheels where you just go right along, and it's got a little, that's the sound it makes too. It leaves a little chalk line, which is super easy. And whenever it is convenient, whenever I'm using a fabric that's easy to mark, I'll mark my seam allowances because it just helps me keep my eye on everything, and it helps just ensure that my seam allowances are correct. So that would be a very close second for me to pressing.
Perfect. All right, seam allowances and pressing. I like it. Well, thank you so much for being here to answer all of our sewing questions, talk about summer sewing, give us some tips on interfacing stabilizer, all wonderful information. Thank you for doing that, and we can't wait to see you again back here next month.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Everyone have a good night.